In the 20th century, America was stained with the major problem of systemic racism. It was completely ingrained into the American way of life. Jim Crow laws were put in place after the end of the Civil War, restricting the civil rights of colored people for close to a century after their emancipation. The institution of slavery stripped black people from their history, their culture, and their identity. Marginalized people sought to create a new identity for themselves and build new lives. It did not help that the society around them was still built on keeping them suppressed. It was very clear that a plan of action was needed, and W.E.B. Du Bois was one of many African American thinkers who attempted to solve these problems and create change for the black community. Du Bois was an influential figure in the progression of African Americans throughout the nation. He advocated for civil rights for black people throughout his life. The Niagara Movement and its publications helped to directly develop the civil rights movement. Without Du Bois' achievements, African Americans could not have progressed as much as they have in the United States. W.E.B. Du Bois, or William Edward Burghardt, was born on February 23, 1868, in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, about 2 years after the end of the Civil War. He attended Fisk University from 1885 to 1888 and Harvard College from 1880 to 1890. In the 1890s, while he was in Philadelphia, he noticed how African American neighborhoods had a bad reputation, consisting of violence and poverty. Here is where he began completing multiple studies on the social conditions of black people. He continued his studies at Harvard, attending the Graduate School for Sociology. In 1894, he received several job opportunities, but ultimately decided to teach at Wilberforce University in Ohio. While working here, a black minister by the name of Alexander Crummell had a heavy influence on his beliefs that ideas and morals are imperative to cause social change. After graduating Harvard in 1896, he became the first African American to earn a PhD from the college. After accepting a job at UPenn, he left Philadelphia and started as a professor at Atlanta University.
While I was there, my faith in knowledge as a solution of the Negro problem was shaken. Lynching was common. Before I went away from there was an average of one lynching every week.
It is important to understand the debate between the two 20th century thinkers, W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. Du Bois contended with Washington on how black people should progress in America. Booker T. Washington argued for the accommodationist belief. This means that he believed that black people should not try and fight for civil rights, and they should instead focus on building up themselves economically, and they should become better educated. Du Bois argued that the key for black liberation was to earn civil rights for the people. He believed civil rights would help develop them economically, socially, and politically. Civil rights would give people of color greater opportunities to flourish.
Du Bois stayed a vocal activist and important social commentator throughout the early 20th century. On April 18, 1903, he published The Souls of Black Folk. This book is composed of many essays detailing the struggles of African Americans, and he gives possible plans to solve them. The book details racism of the United States and its harm on the black community. The book mentioned crucial terms such as double consciousness. This term he came up with said that black people had to have two separate identities, that they had to adhere to white society while also remaining true to their real identities. This means that their identities in public had to appeal to white standards, but they also had to struggle to remain true to their own way of life. This idea is still important to this day. People of color still often must present themselves in a certain way to be accepted by society while trying to stay true to their culture at the same time.
Another important term to remember is the colored line, a term first coined by Frederick Douglass. This term refers to segregation. Du Bois argues that the color line, or segregation, is the issue that directly affects the African Americans the most. In The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois says that the color line is the problem of the 20th century. Segregation kept black people inferior in America, as white people had access to better resources, jobs, education, and opportunities.
The Souls of Black Folk had a tremendous impact, and it is still regarded as one of the most important books of the 1900s. It is known for its impact on African American sociology. The book spreads significant awareness and informs people on these issues before the civil rights movement was even in its full effect. Du Bois was not finished with his writings. He was determined to see his lifelong goal of the advancement of his people. From the early to the mid-20th century, he wrote 6 other notable works. They include Darkwater, Voices from Within the Veil, 1920, The Gift of Black Folk, The Negroes in the Making of America, 1924, Black Reconstruction in America, 1935, Dusk of Dawn, an essay towards an autobiography of a race concept, 1940, The World and Africa, 1947, and In Battle for Peace, 1952. Du Bois' prolific writing portfolio fostered growth in the African American community leading up to the Civil Rights Movement. In 1905, 2 years after The Souls of Black Folk was published, Du Bois and William Monroe Trotter founded the Niagara Movement, along with John Hope, Frederick McGee, and many other African American intellectuals. The main goal was to help create equal rights for Black people and give them economic opportunities and build communities. They held private meetings at Niagara Falls after being denied hotels throughout Buffalo. These meetings took place July 11th, July 12th, and July 13th. During these meetings, they were able to draft a Declaration of Principles. The Declaration stated, "We refuse to allow the impression to remain that the Negro American assents to inferiority, is submissive under oppression, and apologetic before insults." They made a statement saying that African Americans would no longer continue to ignore the harm of their oppressors. The movement used civil disobedience to protest for civil rights and economic and educational equality. Civil disobedience is the purposeful disregard of certain laws or government orders without using violence. This tactic would be famously used decades later in the Civil Rights Movement. Du Bois laid down the foundation through civil disobedience that other civil rights leaders, such as Martin Luther King, would later follow. Due to a lack of funds, the Niagara Movement was put to an end. However, this would not end the impact of Du Bois and the other members. Him, along with Ida B. Wells, Mary Wright Ovington, and certain members from the Niagara Movement, would go on to create the NAACP, or the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, on February 12, 1909.
The NAACP continued the work of the Niagara Movement by advocating for colored people. One of their main goals starting out was to get Congress to pass anti-lynching legislation. After the Civil War, lynches grew as a popular practice. This was when crowds would publicly execute innocent Black people. It was seen as a way to tame them or force them into submission. The NAACP protested in the streets against lynching in different cities across the country. On July 28, 1917, thousands of Black protesters gathered in the streets of New York in silent protest against the violence faced by colored people. They raised money selling blue and red buttons with the words "Stop Lynching" written in bold. In 1918, Representative Leonidas Dyer from Missouri brought forth his anti-lynching bill, intended to make lynching a federal crime. The NAACP supported it and made it pass the House of Representatives before being stopped by Southern Democrats in the Senate. Although the NAACP were not able to get this anti-lynching legislation passed early, they paved the way for others to pass bills in the future. The NAACP would remain a powerful and influential organization throughout the 20th century, specifically during the Civil Rights Movement later, where they organized several peaceful protests and they advocated in favor of Brown versus the Board of Education in the 1950s. The NAACP is still a credible establishment to this day. W.E.B. Du Bois was a very important trailblazer for the activists that would follow him. He argued for rights for African Americans at a time before it became more popular to do so. He also gave the blueprint for protesting change with two very powerful groups, the Niagara Movement and the NAACP. His work and his dedication to civil rights marked an important turning point in history because it directly leads to the start of the Civil Rights Movement, and it is very possible that without him, the progress made for a more equal and just society does not take place.